chestnut Mustang grazed quietly by the fence at sunset when a stranger on a roaring motorcycle tore into the ranch. Without a word, he walked up and kicked the horse hard in the ribs, just because he felt like it. Dakota staggered, and the herd scattered in panic. But what the man didn't know was this. Clayton Reed, the ranch owner and a former cavalryman, was standing right behind him. And from that moment, an unrelenting reckoning began. Afternoon winds rolled through the southern Wyoming valley, carrying the scent of dry grass, sun-baked earth, and the faint, familiar chill of autumn in the mountains. Nestled in a hollow between two red dirt hills stood Dusty Ridge, a quiet sanctuary with endless white fences, weathered gray barns, and open pastures that stretched to the horizon. Here, horses weren't ridden, priced, or sold. They lived as they were meant to, free, named, and trusted. Clayton Reed leaned against an old wooden fence, one hand gripping his wide-brimmed hat, the other wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The wind tousled the silver strands beneath his hat brim, and the wrinkles around his eyes tightened under the slanting sunlight. Nearing 60, Clayton was no longer the man who once rode through the Hellman Valley in dust-covered fatigues. He was now part of this place, of the land, of the wild horses, and of the weather-beaten gatepost bearing the faded letters, Dusty Ridge Sanctuary, where wild souls find freedom. Out in the open field, Dakota stood still beneath the sunset. A chestnut Mustang stallion, the color of scorched summer earth, his tangled mane rippling in the breeze, eyes deep as cold river rock. Clayton had rescued Dakota 4 years ago, finding him abandoned inside a rusted shipping container in the Utah desert. Skin stretched over bone, body torn by wounds, and those eyes, those haunting hollow eyes, had stopped Clayton in his tracks. It wasn't the physical ruin that made him stay. It was the look, silent, agonizing, and suffocating. Since coming to Dusty Ridge, Dakota had never strayed far from Clayton. No one else could touch him. Not Ellis, not the vet, not even the volunteers. But with Clayton, he breathed in rhythm, followed like a shadow, and sometimes in the stillness of night, Clayton believed it was Dakota, not anyone else, who had saved him from the blood-soaked nightmares of a war that ended 3 decades ago. That evening, the sky held no rain. But there was something uneasy in the air. The low growl of an engine echoed in the distance, buried in the wind, laced with the smell of scorched grass. Clayton turned, eyes narrowing beneath his hat brim. At the end of the dusty road, a black Harley-Davidson charged forward, kicking up a storm of dirt. The rider wore a heavy leather jacket, mirrored sunglasses covering half his face, and tattooed arms from shoulder to wrist. He didn't slow down. The ranch gate stood wide open, and the man barreled through like he owned the land. Clayton stepped away from the fence, setting his coffee on the ground. He said nothing, just stood tall, gloved hand tightening at his side. The motorcycle skidded to a stop near the south fence, right where Dakota was grazing. The horse lifted his head, ears alert, eyes narrowing with caution. He didn't bolt, just watched. The stranger dismounted, boots stomping the dirt, saying nothing, asking no permission. He strode toward the fence. Clayton began moving in that direction, but before he could speak, he saw something that froze the blood in his veins. The man stood no more than 10 feet from Dakota. No warning, no calming gesture, no understanding of space or respect. He raised his foot and kicked the horse hard in the ribs. The sound echoed through the field like a whip against concrete. Dakota stumbled, his massive body lurching sideways. The other horses shrieked in panic, scattering in every direction. Sparrows erupted from the fence line. Dust spiraled skyward. For a breathless moment, the world went still. Clayton stopped in his tracks. His hand twitched, shoulders tensed, his heart pounded like old war drums in his chest. But his eyes didn't flare. They went stone cold, like the mountain, like the ghosts of war, like the way he'd once stared down the man who killed his friend in 1986. The biker chuckled, turned away like he'd just toyed with a broken machine. He had no idea he was being watched. Dakota collapsed to his knees, breathing hard, eyes glassy. But he didn't run. He watched the man walk away, not with fear, but with something colder. Disappointment. Clayton turned without a word. He walked straight into the barn, pulled out his old phone, and dialed a number. When the line picked up, he said only 3 words, "Ellis, get here." Beneath the glowing orange sky, Dusty Ridge, the final refuge of forgotten souls, had just been stained by a nameless kick. But here, justice didn't arrive with sirens or handcuffs. It came through eyes, through silence, and through footsteps that had just begun to move. Night fell over the valley like a cold blanket, stretching across the fields, the rooftops of the barns, and the quiet recesses of Clayton Reed's mind. The only light in the barn came from an old fluorescent tube flickering above the rafters, hesitating like it too was unsure of the decision Clayton was about to make. Dakota lay on a bed of dry hay, his head resting lightly against the wooden wall, eyes half-lidded, as if trying to endure in silence. Clayton knelt beside him, one hand pressed gently against the stallion's chest, the other slowly tracing over the bruised area where the kick had landed. No open wounds, but the bruising was deep. And worse than the physical pain was the expression in the horse's eyes. As if he were asking, "Why me again?" Clayton didn't answer. He just bowed his head until his forehead nearly touched Dakota's tangled mane. His breathing slowed and deepened, like he used to do for wounded comrades bleeding out in some forgotten corner of the world. A small gesture, but heavy with memory. The ringtone of his old phone snapped him back to the present. "Ellis here," came the voice of a young man over the line, background music faintly thumping, some laid-back rap. "Kill the music," Clayton said flatly. "We've got a situation." 30 minutes later, Ellis Boone's beat-up pickup rumbled into the yard, headlights slicing through the dusk and landing on the barn door. He stepped out, plaid shirt tied around his waist, ball cap worn backward, walk steady but eyes full of questions. "What happened, Mr. Reed?" Clayton pointed to Dakota. "He was kicked, with full intent, and I saw the whole damn thing." Ellis slowly approached, crouched beside the horse. He sighed, gently running his hand over the bruised hide. "Who did it?" "Biker, leather jacket, snake coiled around a skull tattooed on his left wrist, black Harley, patch on the back, same kind I've seen up around Ogden." Ellis nodded. "Sounds like Devil's Tread, one of the rougher clubs along the Wasatch Range. I've heard stories." Clayton stood up. "I'm not calling the cops. That's not how I do things." "So what are you going to do?" "Justice doesn't always come in uniform, Ellis," Clayton said, his voice steady as wind through pine. "I'm going to talk to him. Not here, on his turf." The next morning, while fog still hung low over the fields, Clayton and Ellis loaded Dakota into the trailer. The Mustang didn't resist. He stepped inside as if he understood that what lay ahead was necessary. They drove down dirt roads, passed through pine woods and small, quiet towns. Around noon, they reached Red Hawk, a weather-worn western town where every bar was dusty and every man wore a cowboy hat, even if he didn't know how to ride. The truck pulled up 50 yards from a biker bar called the Rusted Spur. Clayton stepped out first, adjusted his hat, and stared through the murky windows at the men laughing loudly inside. Ellis glanced sideways. "You sure about this? I can go with you." Clayton shook his head. "I once walked into a Taliban cave with less backup. I'll be fine." He pushed the door open. The air inside reeked of whiskey, sweat, and old leather. Classic rock echoed from rusted speakers. Yellowed lights made everyone look meaner than they probably were. At the center table lounged a man in black leather, buzzed hair, the exact snake and skull tattoo curling around his left wrist. He laughed as beer spilled over his mug and onto the table. But no one cared. Clayton walked straight toward him. Troy Maddox noticed him halfway across the room, paused, then burst into laughter. "Well, damn, cowboy lost a calf?" Clayton didn't smile. "You kicked a living soul that had already been left for dead. I saw it all." Troy leaned back, sneering. "It's a horse, old man. Relax. They don't last long anyway." Clayton took one step closer, eyes never blinking. "I don't forget, and that horse won't either." Silence fell over the bar. The kind of silence men in the West know too well, where nobody jokes, nobody moves, and when one man stands tall and looks another in the eye, people listen. Clayton turned and walked out. No threats, no punches, which was exactly where he began to feel cold inside. Outside, Clayton said nothing. He climbed into the truck. Ellis looked at him, halfway expecting bruises or a bloody nose. "So what now?" "Now," Clayton said as he started the engine, "we let him think he got away with it. Then we make sure the whole damn world knows the truth." Ellis nodded. "Justice, cowboy style." "Exactly," Clayton said. "Partly for Dakota, but mostly so men like him understand. What he kicked yesterday was a soul that survived more than he could ever imagine." On the road back to Dusty Ridge, golden light spilled across the trailer where Dakota lay resting. He didn't move much in the shadows, but his eyes stayed open, watching the narrow slits of light outside. And in Clayton's mind, a plan had begun to take shape. One that didn't need fists or fire, just truth, and the quiet patience of a soldier who's learned what it really means to respect life. The morning sun had barely pierced the silver fog hanging low over the valley when Clayton Reed stepped outside, coffee mug steaming in one hand, his gaze fixed on the barn where Dakota was still resting. In the pale light, the Mustang's red gold coat shimmered like scorched silk, beautiful, yet weighed down by quiet sorrow. Clayton felt a heaviness in his chest. He knew that if he stayed silent this time, he'd be no better than the bystanders. But he also knew the law around here didn't always show up when it should, especially not for a wild horse who couldn't speak. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The name on the screen? Ruthie Glass. Mr. Reed? I just saw your email. The photo of Dakota. Is that real? You think I made it up? Clayton's voice was calm but edged. No, not at all. It's cruel. I can come this afternoon. I want to hear the full story, and I want to meet Dakota. Clayton paused. Bring your camera, you'll need it. By early afternoon, Ruthie Glass pulled into the ranch with a tall cameraman named Ben. Early 30s, sharp eyes, tied-back brown hair, Ruthie had the look of someone who'd share of media storms, but still cared enough to dig for truth. What made Clayton open the gate for her wasn't the camera, but the honesty in her eyes. They sat beneath the porch overhang. Ellis led Dakota out into the field to give them space. Ruthie turned on the recorder, scribbling fast as Clayton spoke. He told her about the kick, about Dakota's eyes, and about the cold, empty reaction of the man who did it. Do you think you should have called the police? Ruthie asked, eyes never leaving his. I used to believe in the law, Clayton replied, but when justice only shows up after the bleeding starts, and morality has been bleeding all along, I choose a different route. And that is? I let the community look into Dakota's eyes. Then they'll know what to do. Ruthie nodded. I'll tell it straight, like a horse that carries its pain with honesty. That evening, the local station Red Hawk Now aired a 4-minute segment. Footage showed Dakota's bruised flank, quiet images of Dusty Ridge, and an interview with Clayton, his voice steady, like a eulogy for a dignity that had been trampled. Within 12 hours, the story went viral. Thousands watched. Animal lovers, ranchers, veterans, and Midwesterners flooded the comments. Kicking a horse is kicking the soul of America. I served. I get why Mr. Reed did what he did. That Maddox guy shouldn't be allowed near anything with 4 legs. The hashtag Tag Justice for Dakota climbed to the top of regional trends overnight. The next morning, Clayton received a call from Sheriff Hatch, the county lawman, a man who once shared beers with Clayton during the county fair, still read print newspapers, and believed in ethics more than paperwork. Clayton, his voice low, I just pulled a black Harley out of a ditch behind the rusted spur. Was it him? Troy Maddox. Drunk. Wrecked it solo. But I saw the broadcast last night, and I think he ought to hear this story, from the horse he kicked. Clayton didn't answer right away. After a long pause, he said, if you're willing, bring him here. I don't need cuffs, I just need him, sober. That afternoon, a county SUV rolled into the ranch. In the back seat sat Troy Maddox. No leather jacket, no sunglasses. Just a man looking around with confusion, fatigue, and something close to regret. Clayton waited on the porch. No weapon, no backup. Just a weathered man whose gaze could slice through steel. Sheriff Hatch stepped out first. He's here, the rest's up to you. Troy climbed out, eyes avoiding everything. Clayton said nothing, just motioned for him to follow. They walked past white fences, across the dry pasture, to a small wooden shed lined with photos before and after shots of rescued horses. That's Dakota. Clayton pointed to an early photo. The Mustang, skin and bones, eyes vacant, mouth crusted with blood. Troy muttered, I didn't know. No, you didn't think, that's the problem. Clayton pointed to the next photo. Dakota in full strength, mane flying, eyes calm and proud. That's the horse you kicked. That's what I fought to preserve after war, after blood, after sleepless years. And you, with one careless boot, tried to destroy all of it. Troy said nothing. His eyes drifted to the yard where Dakota now stood beneath a tree's shadow. Clayton followed his gaze. You've got 2 options. Work here for a month, no pay, no praise, or I take this story to court. Video, interviews, and thousands watching you burn in their minds as a coward." Troy gripped his hat, jaw clenched. After a long pause, he nodded. "I'll work." Clayton didn't smile, just nodded once. "Good. You start tomorrow." As Troy stepped out of the shed, Dakota emerged from the tree line. The Mustang didn't bolt, didn't stare, just stood between two men, like the shadow of justice not yet fully formed. Clayton turned to Troy. "He remembers, but he doesn't hate, he watches." Troy lowered his head. For the first time since arriving, he had no words. That night, as peace settled over the ranch again, Ellis sat with Clayton on the porch, sharing a cold beer. "You really think he can change?" Ellis asked. Clayton looked up at the stars. "I don't know. But I know one thing. If a horse locked in a rusted container can learn to trust again." He paused. "Then maybe a man can too." The sun hadn't yet crested the eastern ridge when the rooster's crow echoed from the far end of the barn. Another morning at Dusty Ridge, where the day began with the smell of hay, the steam of horse breath, and the old stubborn rhythm of life itself. Troy Maddox stood outside the barn door, fumbling with a pair of leather work gloves. The fresh set of overalls Ellis had tossed him the night before didn't suit him at all. Not for a man who used to squat behind bar counters puffing smoke like nothing in life was worth giving a damn about. Clayton didn't wait for him. He was already up, carrying a bucket of water as dawn cracked open the sky. Dakota stood out in the pasture, his mane lifting in the early wind, eyes steady, calm as a monk. Only today, his gaze wasn't scanning the horizon, it was fixed on Troy. Ellis walked up and tossed a broom and shovel his way. "Stalls on the left. 3 horses. Don't ask. Just do." Troy scowled. "Smells worse than the bar dump." "Welcome to real life," Ellis said, walking off without looking back. Mornings at Dusty Ridge weren't meant to clean up the world. They were meant to teach you how to live in it, even when it was messy. Troy figured that out fast. When the shovel cracked, when the sweat rolled into his eyes, when manure clung to his boots and dust coated his neck. But the hardest part wasn't the smell. It was the eyes. Every horse at the ranch watched him, not with fear, but with silence, as if they remembered, as if they knew he didn't belong. Not like Clayton, not like Ellis. Every glance from a Mustang felt like a mirror he didn't want to look into. By midday, while Troy dragged a water bucket toward the far fence, Clayton motioned to him. "Drop it. Come here." Troy trudged over, sun beating down, his shirt soaked through. Clayton handed him an old grooming brush, worn but clean. "Brush, Dakota." Troy's eyes widened. "The one eye?" Clayton nodded. "That's the one. But today, it's not about what you did, it's about what you choose to do now." Troy hesitated. "Is he gonna bite?" "No, but he remembers." Dakota stood in the grass, tied lightly to a wooden post. Not tightly, just enough to say you're free to leave if you want. But he didn't leave. When Troy approached, brush in hand and heart pounding, the horse lifted his head. His ears flicked. His eyes narrowed, not with fear, but with a warning. Troy stopped 3 paces away, swallowed, then whispered, "Hey there." No reaction. He raised the brush slowly and laid it gently against Dakota's shoulder. The horse flinched, just barely, but didn't move. Troy began brushing. His strokes were clumsy, stiff, but not careless. Every sweep of the brush was its own apology, like he was speaking in a language he'd never learned, through his fingers, through his sweat, through the weight of unspoken guilt. Clayton watched from a distance, said nothing. Ellis showed up a moment later, holding 2 water bottles. He handed one to Clayton, both men observing the quiet moment in the pasture. "Not bad," Ellis murmured. "Not enough," Clayton replied. "But it's a start." That evening, Troy collapsed onto a cot in the old bunkhouse, once used by a volunteer vet from Iowa. Now it housed a man learning how to become one again. Later that night, as Ellis boiled water for tea, Troy stepped into the tiny kitchen, eyes red, holding a faded photograph. This is my mom." Ellis blinked. "What?" "Found it in my gear while unpacking. I used to throw everything away. She raised horses, back in Arkansas. Got fired because the rancher didn't want a black woman handling his stock." Ellis sat down slowly. "I felt that. I never trusted anyone, never said sorry and meant it. But today..." Troy paused. "Today I was scared. Scared that Dakota might actually forgive me." Ellis didn't smile. He just looked at him square. "If he trusts you, don't make him regret it." The morning, Troy was up before dawn. He mucked the stalls before being told. When Dakota limped slightly, he was the first to alert Clayton. When a fence rail cracked, he grabbed the hammer. No one asked him to. The changes were small, but they were there. One afternoon, as Clayton photographed the herd, he saw Troy standing beside Dakota. No halter, no lead rope. Just the two of them, side by side. One who had kicked, one who had been kicked. Both still. He snapped the photo. It wasn't sharp, but Dakota's eyes in that frame, he'd never forget them. That night, Clayton scribbled a line in his weathered notebook. Day 7. Troy no longer bows his head out of shame. He looks up because he knows he has something to live up to. By nightfall, the air grew colder. But something inside Clayton was starting to warm again. Not because of Troy, but because of a horse who had shown a man how to live again without ever saying a word. Time at Dusty Ridge wasn't measured in hours. It passed by the rhythm of hooves on dry dirt, wind brushing through pine, and the rustle of sparrows rising with the dawn. For Troy Maddox, the first few days on the ranch had felt like an endless loop. Wake up early, clean stalls, haul hay, walk the horses, collapse at night on an old cot next to the cattle barn. But one morning, he woke up before the rooster crowed, and he no longer counted time by shovelfuls. He counted it by Dakota's breathing. Every day, without fail, Dakota was the first horse Troy checked on. No one asked him to. No one reminded him. But after finishing the stalls, he'd carry a water bucket to the east fence, where Dakota often stood alone, and sit there for a few minutes. At first, it was just to catch his breath, then to observe, and finally, to learn. He studied how Dakota tilted his ears to listen, lifted a hoof to avoid a sharp stone, squinted against the morning glare. Troy started to realize horses weren't just tools. They had their own language, their own feelings, and a kind of silent sorrow only visible to those patient enough to notice. One day, while repairing a feed trough behind the barn, Troy dropped a wrench. The sharp clang echoed off the concrete. Dakota, standing nearly 60 feet away, startled, but didn't flee. He turned, looked at Troy, calm but alert. Troy raised a hand and said softly, "Sorry, bud. That one's on me." Dakota didn't move. Then slowly he turned back to grazing. That same evening, for the first time, Ellis called him something different. "You're part of the ranch now," he said, handing Troy a cold drink. Beyond horse chores, Ellis began taking Troy into the woods to forage for mint grass, a wild herb with a soft, minty scent known to soothe anxious horses. "Horses get stressed too," Ellis explained. "Just like us. Only difference is, they don't have a name for it." Troy smirked. "Hell, I don't even have a name for my own stress." Ellis shot him a glance, hands still sifting through low brush. "Maybe you and these horses got more in common than you think." One late afternoon, with golden sunlight washing over the hills, Troy was helping Ellis mix grain when Clayton walked over and handed him a faded photo. It showed a 6-year-old boy, covered in dirt, grinning wide while riding a Shetland pony. "That's me," Clayton said. The horse's name was Bluebell. Grew up with her. When she died, I didn't speak to anyone for a week. Troy nodded. "Never had a horse, just a cat. My dad kicked it out for messing up the carpet. I guess since then, I figured animals never stick around." Clayton stayed quiet for a moment, then said, "Dakota didn't leave, but he'll only stay if you earn that right." One night, Ellis returned late from a supply run in town. As he approached the barn, he noticed the lights still on. Wind howled outside the doors, making him cautious, but when he stepped inside, the scene stopped him cold. Troy was sitting on the ground, back against the stall wall, scribbling in an old notebook. Dakota stood beside him, no halter, no tether, just standing, his head resting gently on Troy's shoulder. Ellis said nothing. He quietly stepped away. Some moments shouldn't be interrupted. Some lessons, people have to reach on their own. The next morning, Clayton found a rough line of handwriting scrawled in charcoal on the stall wall. "I never thought a horse would teach me how to say I'm sorry." He didn't erase it. Instead, he took paint from the supply shed and carefully traced over the letters, darkening every word. Each day, Troy spoke less. But Ellis noticed, within that silence was a man relearning the language of compassion. He didn't complain when the stalls stank, didn't roll his eyes while tending to the yearling's wound. He knew each horse by name. Knew which one liked a scratch behind the ear, which one only ate the purple clover, which one preferred to nap near the eastern fence when the wind changed. And he knew how to read Dakota's eyes, without words. Sometimes he even smiled, A small, wordless smile, the kind that asked for nothing and meant everything. One night, Ellis and Troy sat on the porch, sharing a lukewarm beer. "Mr. Reed took a photo of you with Dakota," Ellis said. "Hung it up on the rescue wall." Troy looked stunned. "I don't deserve that." "No one does," Ellis replied. "That wall isn't for the perfect, it's for the ones trying." Troy stared out toward the pasture. "You think Dakota's forgiven me?" Ellis took a sip, eyes soft. "He doesn't know what forgiveness means. But he knows trust, and you've done enough to keep him from walking away." Before bed, Troy stood by the fence. Dakota approached like he always did now. "Hey there," Troy whispered. "Did I do okay today?" The Mustang nudged his shoulder gently, then turned and walked off. Troy smiled, just barely, and didn't even realize that, somewhere along the way, the anger inside him had stopped needing to fill the quiet. At a ranch where no one had titles, where horses had names but no reins, Troy Maddox was living days that didn't need labels. But each morning, when Dakota spotted him from across the field, Troy knew, at least one soul in this place remembered who he was. And that was enough. Day 30 at Dusty Ridge looked just like all the others. Wind slipping over the dry fields, a lone whinny echoing from the stables, and soft golden light kissing the rusted barn roof. But for Troy Maddox, nothing felt the same. He sat alone on the porch steps, hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee he hadn't touched. Beside him sat his worn-out duffel bag, the only thing he brought when he came, and the scuffed boots that had softened from a month walking Wyoming dust, manure, and slow forgiveness. Today was his last day. Clayton had told him the night before, plain and simple. "In the morning, you're free to go. No one will stop you. No one will ask why." It should have felt like release. But to Troy it felt like a sentence, like he'd just found something good, and now had to leave it behind without knowing if he'd ever be the same without it. Dakota stood by the east fence, same spot as always. When Troy approached, the horse didn't turn away, didn't come closer either, just stood there, like a mirror waiting. Troy sighed. He'd never said a real goodbye before, not to anyone, not to anything. Now he didn't know where to begin. "Hey," he said softly, voice hoarse. Dakota dipped his head, just enough to acknowledge him. Behind him, Clayton stepped out carrying a worn leather lead rope. It looked older than the barn itself, but well kept. He offered it to Troy without a word. Troy took it slowly. His eyes met Clayton's, quiet, questioning. Clayton nodded toward Dakota. "If he lets you lead him without looking back, maybe it's time you looked back too." Troy swallowed, walked to Dakota, and stopped at his shoulder. He raised the rope gently. Dakota didn't flinch. He looked at Troy with eyes so deep, they didn't just see, they understood. Troy looped the lead gently over the Mustang's neck. "Want to take a walk?" he whispered. Dakota exhaled softly and walked beside him, as if guiding him through a memory he wasn't ready to let go of. Ellis stood in the distance, leaning against the porch column with a mug in hand. He watched them, man and horse, step for step down a dusty path that led nowhere in particular, except back toward something true. That afternoon, Clayton hosted a quiet cookout in the field. No balloons, no speeches, just cold sodas, smoked meat, and familiar faces. Neighbors, former adopters, and Ruthie Glass with a notepad tucked in her back pocket. Dakota stood nearby, his coat glowing bronze under the sun, a saddle draped across his back like a symbol, not a tool. He wasn't a prop, he was proof. Clayton raised his glass. Dusty Ridge ain't a rehab. It's not a hiding place either. It's where people and horses learn how to stand back up when the world's kicked them down. And today, he paused, then locked eyes with Troy. "Troy Maddox, you're not the same man who walked into this ranch 30 days ago." The crowd went quiet. Troy stood slowly, clutching a soda can like it was the last thing anchoring him. "I don't know what to say," he began, voice unsteady. "I used to think horses were just animals, and people just meant to climb over each other to survive. But I was wrong. Dakota's not just a horse. He's a lesson, a teacher without a voice. And somehow, I finally listened." He turned toward the Mustang. "Thanks for not walking away, even when I deserved it." Later that night, Clayton found Troy alone in the barn. The yellow light cast shadows over his face. Older now, not in age, but in understanding. On the wooden wall, the charcoal words Troy once scribbled had a new line below. "I never knew how to say thank you, but now I do." Clayton didn't say a word. He simply rested a hand on Troy's shoulder. "In the morning, if you want to leave, I won't stop you," he said quietly. "But if you choose to stay, you're not a man paying a debt anymore. You're someone helping to protect what matters." Troy nodded, barely audible. "Let's see what tomorrow says." The next morning was cold. Troy folded his blanket, set his duffel on the cot. Dakota stood at the fence, waiting, like he knew the moment was here. Troy ran a hand down the horse's neck. "Thanks, old friend." Dakota nudged his shoulder, gentle as breath. From afar, Clayton watched, didn't interrupt. He knew something was closing, and something else was just beginning. By noon, Troy climbed into the same pickup he once loathed. Ellis sat behind the wheel. Clayton stayed on the porch, raising a hand as they pulled away. No words, just looks. The kind of looks that say everything. As the truck turned the bend out of Dusty Ridge, Troy glanced back. Dakota still stood at the fence, still, silent, not chasing, not retreating. Just there, like a monument to belief, and proof that even a man like him could still matter. 3 weeks had passed since Troy Maddox left Dusty Ridge. September crept into the valley with dry winds and golden brush. Sparrows burst from the fences each morning like smoke from an old chimney. The wild Mustangs returned to their lazy morning gallops through mist-covered fields. Life at the sanctuary returned to its rhythm, familiar but not unchanged. Clayton still rose at 5, poured his coffee black, and walked the perimeter like he had for years. Dakota still stood near the east fence every dawn, ears forward, eyes fixed on the dirt road, as if expecting someone to return. But each morning, only the wind came. Ellis kept busy, partly because it was the season for rescues from Idaho, partly because something quiet inside him missed the grumbling of a man who used to shovel slower than anyone, but always remembered to bring fresh water. Ruthie Glass visited the ranch again, this time with no camera. She just sat on the porch beside Clayton with a cup of tea, gazing at the horses in the distance. "You think he'll come back?" she asked softly. Clayton took a slow sip. "Doesn't matter." Ruthie tilted her head. "Why not?" "Because he took Dusty Ridge with him. Whether he comes back or not, he's not the same man who left." That evening, under the long shadows of the cottonwoods, a worn envelope appeared in the ranch's mailbox. No return address, just a scrawled line in shaky handwriting. To Clayton Reed, the man who didn't look away. Inside was a folded letter, written in blue ink. The paper was creased, smudged, maybe damp from a truck cab or the corner of a diner table. But the words were clear, as if Troy was standing right there, speaking them himself. "Clayton, I've gone farther than the miles between Dusty Ridge and Nevada. I thought that leaving would bring me back to what I was, loud bars, dark alleys, no questions asked. But turns out I'm not that man anymore. Yesterday, I stopped by a livestock yard near Fallon. Saw a small black horse tied to a fence post, ribs showing. No one wanted her. No name. I stood there for over an hour. Didn't know why. Then I bought her. $1. I named her Chance, because she deserves one, just like I got. I'm not saying I've got your patience or Ellis's heart or Dakota's wisdom, but I know one thing. I'll never raise a hand or a boot against a creature again. Not because I'm scared of being seen, but because I finally saw myself in his eyes. Thank you for not yelling, for not hitting back, for letting Dakota speak to me the only way that would work, through silence. Maybe I'll come back someday, not to apologize, but to say thank you. Properly, Troy Maddox." Tucked behind the letter was a photo, plain printer paper, no frame. Troy stood beside a scrawny black Mustang, brushing her neck. She leaned into him, eyes half closed. No halter, no rope, just wind, dry grass, and freedom. Clayton smiled, not big, but real. He slid the letter and photo into the old album reserved for rescued horses. This time, though, it held something else too, a man who had rescued himself. That evening, Clayton walked out to the east field earlier than usual. Dakota stood at the fence, mane catching the breeze like a flag on a mountain. Clayton rested a hand on his neck. "He's doing okay, old friend." Dakota blinked, tilted his head. The wind stirred his mane in soft, slow waves. He didn't reply, but he didn't need to. That afternoon, Ellis hammered loose rails along the north fence when Clayton appeared, journal tucked under his arm. "Need a hand?" Clayton asked. Ellis laughed. "Work goes faster without Troy dragging his boots." Clayton shrugged. "Maybe, but since he left, you've been doing the job of 2 men. Means he might have left slow, but he left something behind." That night, Clayton sat on the porch with a wool blanket over his knees. The moon was late but bright. He opened his notebook and wrote, "No one is born ready to be forgiven, but everyone deserves a chance to change, if someone's willing to wait for them to see who they really are." Dakota didn't need to forgive, he just chose to stay. Dusty Ridge remained the same, quiet, weathered, humble, but now somewhere inside it, there was room. Room for another return, or a new beginning. In Dakota's eyes, the same deep stillness lingered. But if you looked long enough, you'd see a scar, and where the pain had been, now lived understanding. Clayton closed the journal, whispered into the dusk, "Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's choosing to face forward, together." If you believe that a horse can help a man reclaim his humanity, drop a 1 below. If you've ever seen a glance change a heart, leave a 0 in the comments. And if the journey of Dakota and Troy made your heart pause for a beat, hit subscribe so you won't miss our next stories, where trust, redemption, and the bond between humans and animals are told through the eyes that never needed words to begin with.